Thanks for joining us this morning. Welcome to Aspire. I'm sure we're going to have people continuing to wander in a little bit. I understand that there's a lot of slow traffic in Dallas, and that's not new news. That's the normal day here, But thank you so much. We're supposed to have a full house, so we'll continue to have people roll in. It's my honor today to introduce you guys to our speaker. We'd like to introduce you to Michael Gorton. Michael's a serial entrepreneur, 15 companies, I think.
15.
We had to make a list. Internet Global, Teladoc, the Paladura Records, Principal Solar, Back to Space, Mercurio Health. You're credited for being one of the pioneer creators in telemedicine industry. So lots of different things that he's done. His latest book was Digital Medical Home. He co-authored with Jay Sanders, an MD, on the history of telemedicine. He's also written books, Broken Handoff, the #1 M&A business book in 19. He's also done Forefathers and Founding Fathers, which reached the #1 bestseller status on Amazon's fiction chart in 2017. You have a BS in engineering from Tech, an MS in physics from UT, and a Juris Doctorate from Texas A&M. You've climbed how many different mountains?
43 in the U.S.
Wow, and yes, and so in all 50 states. You're an Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year?
Yeah.
And it just goes on and on. So we're delighted to have you today.
Thanks,
I'm looking
Greg.
forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
All right. Well, speaking of climbing mountains, the QR code here goes to my personal website, which has a LinkedIn. If we're not connected, just point your camera at it. Speaking of mountains, this is the highest point of elevation in Texas. And I consider myself to be a Texan, but I was born in Vermont. And my cousins in Vermont are fond of telling me how ugly Texas is. And I get to tell them, take Mount Mansfield, which is their highest mountain, stack it on top of itself, and it's a little bit taller than Texas. So it takes 2 times the tallest mountain in Vermont to reach one mountain in Texas. And of course that goes on and on. So most of what I'm going to be talking about comes from a new book that I just published a couple weeks ago. And I got to thinking this summer that there are things that people do that turn into success. And when I was a young engineer coming into the business world, I thought success is about not making many mistakes. I remember as an engineering student sitting in the big auditorium with all the other freshmen, and the dean is saying, look left, look right, only one of you will be here at graduation. And in my particular case, left is a valedictorian, right is a salutatorian, and I graduated number 32 in my class. And I thought, oh boy, what am I going to do? How do you get through this? And I think over the years, I've learned kind of the things, but I've never put them down into a concise format that can define how do you get to success. And as it turns out, mistakes are one of the key elements. And in corporate America, we look at mistakes as a bad thing. And I think we need to fix that. Now, stupidity is one thing. Making mistakes, something we do every day. There was a really good scientific study that was published a few years ago where they said the average person makes 30,000 decisions a day, and over 1,000 of them are mistakes. And we just don't think about it. We think about it when we're walking in our bare feet and we stub our toe. That's a mistake that hurts. And we swear a little bit. And then our wife's mad at us for swearing, and then there's another mistake. So, those kinds of things happen all the time, and we just go through them. But the reality is that mistakes are things that we can turn into opportunities. And so I started interviewing a large number of people, about 100 people, to get their stories on mistakes they've made and calamities they've had happen to them and how they turned them into opportunities. And it turns out that's the really secret ingredient to success. When we're knocked down and kicked in the teeth, how do we react? And so the title of this book, it's called Calamastunity, And so the stories that I'm going to tell are the interviews and the research that I did that resulted in this book. And I think, so the first one that I want to talk about starts with a lady who some of you may know. Her name is Becky Halstead. And when Becky was in high school, her coach was her hero. And I was interviewing her, and she was talking about this lady named Carol Lavena, who was so inspirational that Becky decided that what she wanted to do with her life was become a coach and inspire young women. And I know Becky personally. Some of you may also know her. I said, what sports did you play in high school? And she said, I was the star basketball player. Becky's this tall. I mean, she's 5 foot on a good day. And so that should tell you already a little bit about Becky. This was in the time period when West Point had just announced they were going to let the first women class in. So she was a junior in high school, so she wouldn't have been in that first women's class. Her mom wanted her to go to West Point. Becky was like, nope, I'm going to be a coach. I'm going to be just like Carol Lavena. And so, but moms have a lot of force, and so Becky said, rather than fighting this, what I'm going to do is I'll go ahead and apply. I won't get accepted, and I'll just move down the road. And so as part of the process, she goes to Coach Lavena and says, I need you to write me a letter. She does, fills out all the application, and then does the applications for the school she really wants to go to. 10 days after those applications went in, her coach, who was a competitive skydiver, is in one of these big rings, and the person that opens before her opens too soon. Her chute hits Carol Lavena, knocks her out. She never pulls her ripcord. Lavena falls through her boyfriend's parachute, destroying his parachute, and falls to the ground to her death. Her boyfriend, fortunately, had enough time to pull the second chute, but for Carol Lavena, she was unconscious. She was not able to do it. So now imagine high school Becky Halstead. Her hero has just been killed in an accident. She's more determined than ever now to replace her and become the inspirational coach. A couple months later, so I think everybody knows, if you want to go to one of the U.S. military academies, you do so with a nomination from your congressman or your senator. And the U.S. senator from New York, which is where Becky was living, called her and said, I'm going to nominate you. And she said, I don't want to do it. And he said, come in anyway for the interview. So she goes into the interview. She tells him again she doesn't want to do it. He interviews her anyway. 2 weeks later, he sends her the packet saying, I've nominated you. You're going to get in. In the packet is the handwritten letter from Coach Lavena. Posthumously, Lavena convinced Becky to go to West Point. And this was probably one of the, so, how do you see a calamity like this and turn it into something positive? So Becky decides, based on Lavena's letter, to go to West Point. She's in the second women's class at West Point. And Becky has almost every honor that you can get. As a soldier this tall, she's the first woman to command combat troops. She's the first woman out of West Point to become a general. She's in the Women's Hall of Fame. Her list of credentials goes on and on and on. And it happened because of a calamity. She turned that into something positive. And later, when she was in the first Afghanistan war, Becky was one of these leaders who felt like whatever happened to her soldiers happened to her. And one day they were out on patrol. There was a explosive device, killed one of the soldiers, severely injured one of the others. And she goes to the hospital, and she's talking to this young soldier, and he's just lost his best friend. And he's suicidal. And she thought, I remember this feeling from when I was in high school. And so she took that and turned it into another form of leadership. And so I think Becky is my first example of a calamity. Steve Jobs is one of my favorite. So I didn't get to interview Steve. I met him a few times in the early days. And if you think about the late 1970s, when the personal computer was introduced, Steve Jobs and Wozniak introduced something that revolutionized the way we live in our homes and work in our businesses. And what Jobs built was nothing less than extraordinary, changed the world, and during his career, he got crosswise with his board, and his board fired him. Can you imagine? I think about this all the time because as a serial entrepreneur, I've gotten crosswise with my board. And so I know what it feels like. But can you imagine having that on your resume? Yeah, I was on the board of directors that fired Steve Jobs. Not a good thing. I think you could say I was on the board of directors, but don't put the time frame. So, Jobs leaves Apple. What does he do? He forms Pixar, he forms another computer that Apple buys, and then he ends up as CEO and becomes one of the most famous technology CEOs in the history of the world. Part of the whole innovation was sparked at that termination. So what happens to Steve Jobs when he gets terminated is first there's a period of anger, then grief, and then he's thinking, okay, I'll show them. How do I do that? And so he gets super innovative. Pixar, if you think about those first Pixar movies, Toy Story, that was all Steve Jobs. And those things that he did during that time period where this disaster hits him and he has to respond to it. So going back to that board of directors, maybe we should thank them because what they did was they sparked Steve moving to a whole new level. And so I think, this is part of the big picture of how do you become successful? Sometimes you have to get knocked down and kicked in the teeth. And you have to figure out how am I going to recover from that. So one of my favorite stories of all time, everybody knows this story, is Leonidas and the 300. So let me give you a little bit of the back story. I never met Leonidas, by the way. I do have gray hair. He was a little before my time. But think about what's happening. The Persian army, the historians argue about how many people were in it, but somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million soldiers. Everywhere they went, they just destroyed the enemy. And Leonidas decides he's going to pick 300 guys as the front line to stop these guys. Well, he was using a little bit of tactical, and we won't go into that. But behind the scenes, what was Leonidas doing? He wanted the best soldiers in the world. So, okay, what does that mean? They're athletic, they know how to fling a sword, they know how to fire arrows, they know how to use their shield, they are physically fit. But Leonidas wanted something else, and this was the secret ingredient, and this is one that everyone should remember. So, Leonidas wanted everybody to understand and live the opposite of fear. And in the business world, fear is a huge mitigating factor. If we're scared of something, it's going to impact how we work every day. And so what do we have to do to reverse fear? Well, guess what? The Persians knew how to create fear. What Leonidas was told as he was preparing for this battle was the first thing the Persians will do is every single soldier will flight 2 arrows, right? There will be, if you use the small number, 300,000, there will be 600,000 arrows in the air. That's 2,000 for every one of Leonidas' soldiers. What they told Leonidas was, there will be so many arrows in the air that it'll block out the sun. Does anybody remember what Leonidas said? We'll fight in the shade. I'm a little bit of a scientist and a mathematician still, and so I tried to do the math on 600,000 arrows. It's way bigger than a football field with zero distance between the arrows. It's a lot of arrows. What's the opposite of fear? Every mom knows this. If a grizzly bear is attacking a child and a mom is there, the grizzly bear is in trouble. The opposite of fear is love. So what Leonidas wanted was soldiers who understood this fundamental, what is the opposite of fear? Because if they love what's behind them, they are not going to run under any circumstances. When every single soldier is fallen and only 2 are left, and there's still 500,000 people coming at them, they'll fight. This is a really critical thing, and I learned this actually across the street in 2005. I was running Teladoc at the time. We had about 30 employees. And some of you may know, Teladoc was very controversial. The boards told me I was going to go to prison. That's no big deal. Every entrepreneur deals with that, right? But one day I'm sitting in my office, and Ruthie, I guess you probably know Ruthie, comes in. She never comes in my office. And I'm in a meeting. And I look at her, and what's up, Ruthie? And she whispers in my ear, the DEA is here with guns and badges. So I'm not talking about this kind of gun. I'm talking about this kind of gun. And so we're in that building on the northeast corner of Spring Valley and the toll road, right? And I'm at the end of a very long hallway. And I'm thinking as I'm walking down the hallway, I'm the last person in the building probably to know that they're here. And I'm walking by all these offices with my fellow employees, looking in the office thinking, are they concerned they're going to be walking away from this place in handcuffs today? And what I realized after I got down, and I've told this story so many times, I'm not going to get really to the end of it, but everybody in that office knew why we were there for Teladoc. They were like the 300. They loved what they were standing for. They loved the principle that Teladoc stood for, and they felt like we could convince the DEA that what we were doing was not wrong. And it turned out, the DEA, after 3 months of tearing our office apart, became a customer of Teladoc. And nobody ran and hid that day, and everybody probably thought about it for a second. The next story is a local entrepreneur that I know pretty well. If you don't know him, you ought to. His name is Fab Mancini. And Fab is half Italian, half Latin American. And as a young kid, he was going to go to medical school. He finished his undergrad. He got accepted in one of the best medical schools in the country. And before he started, he had an accident. And the accident put him in the hospital for a long time. The doctors couldn't figure out how to get him back on his feet again. And he was very frustrated with it. So he missed the start of medical school. And he started asking people, how can I recover from this? And somebody said, use a chiropractor. And he said, no, that's black magic. I'm not going to do that. People kept telling him to do it, and the doctors were saying, you're never going to recover from this. You're going to be debilitated the rest of your life. And so, as a last effort, he went to a chiropractor, and the chiropractor made him better. And then he decided, I'm going to become a chiropractor. Okay, so now picture this. This is a Latin American kid, which means he has a Latin American mom. And he's supposed to start at Harvard Medical School the following August, and now he's going to call her and say, Mom, I'm not going to go to medical school. I'm going to become a chiropractor. Not good. So that's the first obstacle that Dr. Mancini had to overcome. But he ended up coming here to a small school that had a few hundred students called Parker. And at Parker, he was the #1 student. He became friends with Parker, the guy who started the school, and Parker became a mentor. He finished his chiropractic program, went out into the real world, started making a lot of money, and Parker decided he was going to retire. So the board calls him and says, Dr. Fab, we'd like you to take over as president. And he said, nope, not going to do it. I'll help you find one. So they spent a few months interviewing 20 some odd people. 3 of them were from the board. And they called him at the end of him helping, and they said, we found our new president. And he said, okay, who is it? And he said, you. And he said, no, I did not want to be it. And they said, well, you're the one we want. And he said, I tell you what, I'll become the president if you get 100% of the members of the board to vote that I'm going to become the president. And he didn't say that because he wanted 100% approval. He said it because he knew 3 of the members of the board wanted to be the president, and he thought, okay, this will keep it friendly between us. But guess what? They came back to him the next day and said, you're now the president. Okay, so now we have this guy who's the youngest person to be a president of a university in the entire United States. And the professors are up in arms. They say, we don't want this kid as our president. The students hear about it, and they're all starting to fill out their paperwork to transfer to another school. So now he's got a major disaster on his hands. And he meets with every single one of the students, he meets with every single one of the professors, and gets them turned around. And now Parker is the #1 recognized chiropractic school in the entire world. When he took over, there was 1 degree. Are you a Parker person?
I know several people who went there.
Yeah. So Parker is the definitive thought leader on chiropractic in the world now. They have 21 PhDs now, where they had 1 back then. They're in a major campus here in town, and every chiropractor in the world knows his name. He took that situation and turned it into a major opportunity. He took being the youngest president of a university, which was the source of resistance, and turned it into a positive. I'm somewhat of an athlete. I used to be a decent runner. I used to be a decent cyclist. In the 80s, I followed cycling quite a bit. And any other cyclists in the room? None. Okay. So let me tell you about one. Okay. Let me tell you about this race called the Tour de France, because this thing is a monster. It is easily, arguably, one of the hardest, maybe top 5 hardest things any athlete can do. It is day after day of grueling physical activity, mountain climbing, twists and turns, accelerating, speed work. You have to have all kinds of bicycling skills to win it, including understanding teamwork. And in the 80s, Americans had never won it. And we had this guy, Greg LeMond, who was the big promising superstar. And we knew that LeMond was probably going to control and win the Tour de France many, many times. And then he was in a hunting accident. And kind of like Dr. Mancini, when he's laying in his recovery bed, this superstar cyclist, the doctors are saying, you're never going to race again. You probably won't ever be able to ride again. And LeMond was like, I don't care what you say. I'm getting back out there. And so after coming out of the hospital, getting on that bicycle again was really difficult. And he was determined that so this happens in the fall, he was determined that he was going to be good enough to qualify for the tour the following summer. It happens in July every year. And And he was, but there's a lot of teamwork associated with the Tour de France. And you have to know how to draft the person in front of you, how to work with all of the rest of the team, and how to do all the things to properly recover from the grueling fight of doing this race. And so the fact that he made it back in the first place was interesting. The press was doing stories with him saying, oh, Greg LeMond is back. He's not going to win, but everybody should celebrate the fact that he went from doctors saying he's never going to ride again to he's able to ride. And the guy who had won the year before was the expected winner, and another guy, another French guy who was one of the best cyclists ever, was going to compete with him, and Le Mans wasn't even going to be in the race. But Le Mans stayed in the top 10 all the way through, and the press started going, wow, this is kind of interesting. I wonder how he's doing this. But on the last day, which nobody in the history of the race has changed positions on the last day. On the last day, Greg LeMond is, do you remember, 50, 60 seconds behind. But nobody has ever won the race. It's impossible to do. It's a flat race, everybody's working together, and the guy who's ahead is so far ahead that he's just not going to get caught up. But about a quarter through the way through the race, LeMond has made up seconds, more seconds than anybody has ever made. And at the halfway point, he's just a few seconds behind. And now everybody in the world is talking about it. They're going, wait, is it possible? Can Greg LeMond actually win this race? And so if you know anything about the Tour, it comes into Paris through the Champs-Élysées. And as he's coming down through the Champs-Élysées, he's now past the guy in first place. And he makes up another 8 seconds. Absolutely impossible situation. But I think this is sort of an inspirational thing. Everybody wrote him off. The doctors wrote him off. His friends wrote him off. Everybody wrote him off. And he did not write himself off. And I think that is something that in the business world, we can learn a lot from the athletes. I had a great time interviewing athletes. Roger Staubach is in the book. I talked to Darren Woodson. I talked to a lot of athletes. But what I found is professional athletes have so many lessons for the business world that we can use analogously that help us kind of move to the next piece. I think the next thing, and when I wrote this chapter on the blame game, I thought about one thing is more destructive to our business endeavors than anything else, and that is the blame game. Because if you think about it, we're all leaders in our companies. What do we really need for everybody to be doing? We need them to be as efficient as possible. But when we have one person, maybe it's us, maybe it's somebody else in management, maybe it's somebody on the team, pointing a finger saying, yeah, he's not doing his job, then what happens is the entire infrastructure begins to dissolve. And, so blame is one of those things that in this chapter in the book, I wanted to be super careful because there's lots of examples of it, but I don't want to get powerful people really ticked off at me. But when I was writing the book, the U.S. women's national team was playing soccer. And you couldn't turn on the TV without seeing the blame game, right? Everywhere you looked, the girls on the field were blaming each other. The former champions were pointing fingers, blaming this person, the newscasters, everybody was blaming. And guess what? Those poor girls were the best female soccer players in the competition, and they couldn't play up to their level because they were always all concerned about this person blaming. And this is such a huge lesson for us as business leaders. When we see this happening in our business environments, we've got to kill it right away. And I think one of the greatest examples of doing this is Nelson Mandela. I mean, think about this guy. His oppressors put him in prison for 27 years. there's a poem some of you may know that he memorized and kept with him the whole time he was there called Invictus. Anybody know that poem? It's worth making a note and looking up. But why, when he gets out, it's not because his oppressors let him out. It's because the United States and other countries around the world put so much pressure on the South African government to end the whole apartheid thing. But now think about Mandela coming out of his confinement, and there's still members of his oppressors in the leadership in South Africa. He should be angry with them. He should blame them for it, but he doesn't. You know what he says? He says, the only way we're going to become one South Africa is if everybody works together and we forget about all that stuff in the past. It was one of the greatest things that any human has ever done. And anybody ever been to South Africa? I went with my, I've been to Africa many, many, many times, and my wife went with me a few years ago, first time to Africa. And Johannesburg and Cape Town are like cities in Europe. There's no other place like that. Go to Lagos, go to any other city in Africa, and you're not going to see European caliber cities. And that's all because Mandela took a position. Now, I think that position has evaporated quite a bit, and South Africa is now in much more of a us against them kind of world. But what Mandela did is absolutely extraordinary, and fundamentally he just said, we're not going to blame anybody. Everybody here can bring value, and we're going to figure out how to have them bring value. And this is such a valuable lesson for us. You know, this is the one thing that you absolutely have to kill when it happens. I interviewed a lot of people in the trust and ethics chapter, and one of my favorites is a local guy named Alan West, but he's politically controversial, so I'm going to leave his story on the side for now. And I think trust and ethics are the one thing that, if we had a secret ingredient for trust and ethics, we could all do business better. And I think about this all the time because I've started 15 companies and I've worked in many more than that. And the one thing that I always think about in the very beginning of any business relationship is, can I trust this person? And you know, trust is easy in an environment where everything is working well. But what happens when it gets tough? What are they going to do then? And it's so difficult. I don't have the secret ingredient personally, but I do have the secret ingredient. And it's my wife. You know, when I'm starting to do business with people, and I'm still stupid enough to do this wrong, but I start doing business with people and I know that I'm going to be doing a lot with them, I just casually say, you know, why don't you and your spouse and Shelley and I get together with you for dinner? And Shelley knows her mission then. We have dinner, we talk. At the end of dinner, she knows what I'm going to do. Okay, should I be doing business with this person? And I can tell you, in the last 15 years, I've argued with her and said, nope, you're wrong about this one. I know this guy is ethical. I know this woman is ethical. I'm going to do business with this person. She's right every time. Every time she says, don't do it, and I do, I step in the doo-doo. But I have one kind of super interesting story, because the reality is unethical people are smarter than us in the area of tricking us. What do we do every day? We try to figure out how to build our businesses. We try to figure out how to produce more revenue for our stakeholders. And so I was building this company in the 90s called G Squared. And I was selling very specialized computers around the world. And I started advertising. And with advertising, I was making more money. So in the beginning, I thought, oh, this is working really well. This guy calls me from California, and He just orders a small thing from me. But he's very chatty and very friendly. So I talk to him, and a few days later he calls me and orders something else. And then he starts talking about this big deal that he's working. It's a really big deal with one of the city governments. It's going to be tens of thousands of dollars. And for about 3 months, he strings me along talking about, I need to order a couple of this and that's and just cheap stuff. And then one day he calls me and he goes, I got the big deal. I need $30,000 of equipment. And back then, when we were shipping equipment, the way we did it was, we'd build it, we'd box it up, UPS would come get it, UPS would deliver it, and they would pick up a cashier's check and bring it back to us. That's the way we did business back in the early 90s. So I know the guy. He's my friend. I've talked to him on the phone 100 times. He's been telling me about this deal forever. And now I'm cheering, yay, you got the deal. I'm happy for you. So we put together all the equipment. We send it UPS ground. He calls me the next day and he goes, it's even bigger. He's really excited. I need another $25,000, $30,000 worth of equipment. I went, okay. And he goes, I need it here the same day. So can you send that one second day? I'm like, you got it. You're my friend, I'll get it done for you. So we work overtime, we get the stuff all put together for him, we get it shipped. The next day he calls me and he goes, even more, but this I need overnight. And so boom, boom, boom. Now he's got me, right? I'm $150,000 into this deal, and I'm a small businessman. And, but I'm still celebrating because my friend has gotten this huge deal. And then the cashier's checks come back. And I look at them and I go, these aren't like normal cashier's checks. And I go to the bank, and the bank goes, oh, they're cashier's checks, no worries. The next morning I wake up and all of my accounts are frozen. I hire a private detective, and this guy was so good, I wasn't the only one. He was working half a dozen people, half a dozen companies around the country. And what's even more interesting was the private detective, when we went back to UPS, so first thing we do is we go check the shipping address. Okay, where is this guy? It was an open field. He would show up with his pickup truck and tell the UPS driver, I keep telling these people that the address is wrong and they keep shipping it here and those idiots are shipping to the wrong place, and so I have to come out here. So he's even making friends with the UPS driver. I never caught the guy. He was that good. But I think I learned a valuable lesson, and that is, well, trust Shelley, but this is one of the most difficult things. If we're going to do business well, we need to be doing business well with people that we can trust, that are going to stand on their ethical foundations, even when things get tough. And that's really hard to do. So my advice to you is cross-reference, check references, trust your spouse. All right. So I'm almost to the end, but about 10 minutes from the end. And so I want to wrap this with a comment, but first I want to make sure that you understand something about me. The young kids these days say, I identify as a, and I'm not going to say anything because when Simon saw me, he said, man, you got a ponytail now. I identify as a scientist and an engineer. And so what I'm about to say is going to sound really weird. My best advice to everybody is be lucky. And so, wait a minute, okay. How can you really be a scientist and an engineer and say be lucky? And so let me explain it. I'm going to start with the War of 1812, because I think this is a really interesting story. The young country had just won a war against the most powerful military in the world. What in the hell were we thinking declaring war against England in 1812? I mean, think about it. The British never got over the fact that we cornered them in Yorktown and and they had to surrender. So by 1812, George Washington is gone. Nathaniel Greene is gone. The two great generals who really won the Revolution are gone. And Madison gets us into this conflict with the British. Well, you know what? They happily jumped on their ships. They came over and they were killing us. They burned Washington, D.C. to the ground. And I think everybody knows the story of this camp at Fort McHenry. And if you don't know it, it's buried in the song, The Star-Spangled Banner, right? The Star-Spangled Banner doesn't tell the lucky part of this whole thing. So the British ground forces are cleaning up. The British Navy is bombarding Fort McHenry. And the only thing the guys at Fort McHenry are saying is, let's keep the flag standing no matter what. They actually really knew they were going to get decimated because there were more ships in the harbor that day than the Americans had the capability to stop. But something happened. Anybody know? I don't know why the history books don't tell this, but something happened that stopped the British in the harbor that day and in their fight across the country. It was a perfect storm. One of these weather events that maybe now we could predict. Maybe now the British Navy would have satellites saying, okay, don't bombard. This perfect storm decimated the ground troops and decimated the Navy bombarding Fort McHenry. And it was that very lucky event that became the reason that we didn't become colonies again. That was pure luck. That's not what I'm talking about. So there's a great book by Richard Wiseman called The Luck Factor. And so Wiseman is a scientist, and he wants to figure out why some people are lucky and some aren't. And what he does is he gets 100 people that consider themselves to be lucky and 100 people that consider themselves to be unlucky. And the other thing that he wants is he wants people who are hardworking. So it's not just lazy, unlucky people and really hardworking, lucky people. He wants similar traits from both of them. And I'll tell you about one of the studies that he does that makes it into real science. So he gets them all in a room, and one of my college professors did this. Some of you may remember, if you had a really great college professor, the professor maybe said, always read the instructions before you do the test. And one of my engineering professors said that over and over and over to us. And I guess I got lucky and listened, because one particular test, the instruction said, do not put your pencil on this paper. Write nothing. If you erase, I'll see it. Write nothing. Sit there, pretend like you're working for 30 minutes, sign the last page, and turn it in. And if you do, I'll give you 100. So I'm looking at, he also said, don't look around to see who else is doing it. So he's sitting there watching everybody. I'm looking at my paper, trying not to look around. I wait to the 30 minutes, and a whole bunch of us start turning our papers in all at once. And everybody else is looking up going, man, I'm only on page 1 of 4, how are they done? And so we all left. We got our hundreds. We read the instructions, right? Okay, so what did Wiseman do? He gave everybody in the room a newspaper. And he said, so Wiseman is British, so pounds are money, right? So he says, count the number of pictures in the newspaper. And if you get it right, I'll give you 100 pounds. That was it. That was his only instruction set. So he hands the newspaper all out. On the second page is a headline that says, mention this headline and sit at your desk and then turn it in, and I'll give you 200 pounds. So all the lucky people, they turn in the newspaper and they go, there's 41 pictures, and by the way, there's a headline that says I get 200 pounds. Okay. And so, all the lucky people get it right, all the unlucky people don't. Okay, so now we have a truly learning moment. And this is how you become lucky. And I think most everybody in this room is already doing this, but let me crystallize it for you. So now he takes the unlucky people and he says, all right, what happened? You're a hard worker? What happened? Well, I didn't see it. You told me to count pictures. I was looking for pictures, and I got it right. Some of them said, yeah, I saw that, but I thought it was a trick. Your instructions to the group were count the pictures, not read headlines. And so even though I saw it, I didn't do anything about it. And then some of them just didn't even know, right? It's interesting that all of the lucky people figured it out and all of the unlucky people did not. So what is the difference? I told Greg this morning and Simon when I started, I said, yeah, I'm starting this new speaking tour. My friend Dr. Fab is doing $40,000. I'm starting a speaking tour where I'm doing they're paying me $15,000 to give speeches. But why do we come to things like this? The thing that Wiseman realized is lucky people are always looking for opportunity. The newspaper clearly shows this. Everywhere we go, we're introducing ourselves, we're making friends, we're going, what do you do? Listening to what they do. Everything is an opportunity. Everywhere we go. And I think what Wiseman ultimately realized is lucky people aren't lucky like the War of 1812. Lucky people are lucky because they're always looking for opportunity. And unlucky people are not lucky because they're just doing their jobs. Everywhere you go, look for opportunity. Go places where you wouldn't normally go and meet people you wouldn't normally meet. This is how you create luck. And so I'll end with that. Be lucky.
Questions?
Where's the book sold?
It's on Amazon.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
In your research, did it seem to you that a lot of this what the people were born with, or did they learn it somewhere along the way? Was there a clear pattern that emerged as you were visiting with these people?
I think to some degree, one of my realizations was it was good parenting. I interviewed about 100 people. I researched 100 events from history. The invention or the discovery of penicillin is a really good example of this, right? Because this sort of almost fits in the luck category, because if you think about what was happening with Fleming, he was doing an experiment. The experiment was destroyed because there was a mold there. But rather than just throwing it away, which is what the young scientist should have done, he looked at it and he said, there's something unusual here, I'm going to figure it out. And he could have just thrown it away, and the invention of penicillin would have happened much, much later. So I think maybe our parents put this into us, maybe during our educations. But the thing that I find in rooms like this is just about everybody here is lucky. And if you want a little more precision on it, start doing the things that I said. Look for opportunity everywhere and recognize we're still going to get knocked down and kicked in the teeth. Even lucky people have that happen all the time, right?
Any other questions? Thank you for joining us today. one thing, Kim and I were watching television yesterday, it's not something we get to do very often, and to follow up on your comment, thought it was really interesting. They said one of the really two key things to being a really great parent, and I think the same thing with a leader, is said 81% of the time, keep saying the same thing over and over again.
81% of the time.
Yes, and the rest of the 100%, keep the refrigerator full of food. And having a 28-year-old son who just finished his JD MBA, I can tell you both those things are true. So I think it is correct that we can have an impact. That's why we do Aspire. That's why we try and do things like this, is to make ourselves think about what are the things that are not just numbers and dollars kind of stuff, but what are the intangibles that we need to think about. So thank you for coming. If you want CP credit, check with them on the way out. Hopefully we got your parking validated for you. We're working on some other speakers. We've talked to someone about, with all the different strikes, about what's going to happen in the auto industry. At the rate we're going, cars will be $200,000 a year instead of, I understand this morning that Kaiser Permanente's people went on strike too in different places. So, there's lots of change going on. We're going to try and continue to embrace that stuff and help you learn from it. So thank you again so much. Have a great week, and stay out of the Dallas traffic. Okay?